China's once-in-a-decade leadership transition is kicking off amid corruption scandals and factional infighting within the country's Communist Party. Here now to tell us more about what we can expect from the 18th Chinese Communist Party Congress, Gordon Chang. He's a contributor at Forbes.com and always a welcome guest in these parts. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's start with the background. China's 18th Party Congress. What is that to begin with?
Well, the Party Congress these days meets once every 5 years. And as you point out, every other one you have a once-in-a-decade transition. So we're going to see the fourth generation leaders, led by Hu Jintao, give way to the fifth, presumably under the command of Vice President Xi Jinping. At the beginning of this year, every China watcher, almost every China watcher, said that this was going to be a smooth transition, because this is what the world wanted to hear. But of course, since the beginning of February, we've learned that this is especially troubled time, and the troubles have come one right after the other. So at this point, a lot of people are worrying about the Communist Party and whether it'll be able to govern effectively.
As transitions go, though, there's always bumps in the road with any transition,
Sure.
be it in a democracy or in China. How's this one relative to previous ones that you've watched?
Well, this is just unprecedented. This really goes back, you have to go back to the beginnings of the People's Republic to see a problem as big as this one. You know, in the beginning of February, we saw China's most openly ambitious and charismatic politician, Bo Xilai, send an army of hundreds of armed security troops across provincial lines to surround the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. And there, Bo's troops were confronted by the security forces of other leaders. So our diplomats were being held hostage to this political crisis that had really been engineered in Beijing. And from there, we've had car crashes, we've had fights in boardrooms, we've had everything. You just couldn't make this stuff up.
Well, let's go into this a little bit, because I think it's worth spending a bit of time explaining all of these different bumps on the road that have taken place, which, as you point out, have been quite extraordinary. Okay, Bo Xilai, what you just described, that's not the beginning, middle, and end of the story with him, right? What's happened to him since then?
Well, since then, he's been stripped of his Communist Party post, and he's been transferred to judicial authorities. He will be put on trial, perhaps for capital crimes. His wife has already admitted to a murder. His top lieutenant, Wang Lijun, was essentially charged with treason, and he's been now in prison for about 15 years. So this has really been a problem, because Bo wanted to sit on the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the group that runs China. This is the group that runs the Communist Party. The Communist Party runs China. And Bo, you know, who has represented the military or elements in the military, plus the leftists, you know, the Maoists, has really rocked the Chinese political system.
Now, you talked about a car crash. This is the demotion of Ling Jihua, a key ally of Hu Jintao, following his son's fatal car crash. What happened there?
Well, in March, Ling Gu, who was his son, was involved in this car crash. He died. There were 3 people in this 2-seat car. The allegation is that there was a sex game, because the police found all 3 of the occupants in various stages of undress. Now, this is lurid, but the reason why this is important, and the reason why we talk about it, is because it triggered intense infighting between Jiang Zemin, the former leader, and Hu Jintao. Because Ling Jihua, Ling Gu's father, was Hu's closest personal aide. And really what this shows is that at this point, there's no elders really to enforce discipline. There's no Mao Zedong, there's no Deng Xiaoping, a strong man to basically keep the fighting in bounds. And that's why even something like a car crash can trigger this demotion months later.
Xi Jinping, one of the new men slated to take over, disappears for a while. What happened there?
We really don't know. The semi-official explanation is that he had a back problem. Well, the Washington Post sort of confirms that it was a back problem, but not because he was playing squash, as what we were told. There was apparently this story that Xi Jinping was hit in the back with a chair because he got in between 2 other leaders who were fighting. Now, this is just implausible, but nonetheless, it's no more implausible than the car crash or with the surrounding of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. I mean, these stories just continue to keep going, and we really don't know what other things have happened.
Do you think, I mean, you watch this stuff, do you think that's really plausible, that he got in the way of somebody attacking another guy with a chair? This is the incoming president, after all.
Right. It is just, you know, people complain about the American political system as being noisy and ineffective. Well, this is just, I don't know really what to say. I never thought this transition would be smooth, but nonetheless, I never thought it would go off the rails to this extent.
Let's do one more here. Wen Jiabao, alleged by the New York Times in a massive front-page expose that lasted many days, is alleged to have amassed, well, almost $3 billion in wealth during his tenure. A Communist Party leader basically amassing a personal fortune. How do all of these allegations, first of all, I should ask, do the Chinese people know about these allegations?
Well, they do now. And they also know about the allegations of Xi Jinping because a few months ago, Bloomberg did a story about the wealth gathered by Xi Jinping's family. In both of these stories, neither Bloomberg nor the New York Times alleged wrongdoing on the part of either Xi Jinping or Wen Jiabao. But these things don't happen in the absence of wrongdoing. And clearly, you know, the story about Wen Jiabao is completely demoralizing because first of all, he's the head of government in China. And also, he gave this image of being clean and honest and being really caring for people. And so this completely destroys whatever myths people still believed about the Communist Party. And I think that's really a problem because now you see that even someone like Premier Wen, Grandpa Wen, as he called himself, really is just as corrupt as all the rest.
So it does have a demoralizing impact on the public, you think, as they get set for this 18th Congress?
I think so. And you can see that with really how much the party has tried to prevent this news from being spread around China. And also about Wen's attempt to try to clear his name, which is really unprecedented. Because Xi Jinping went completely quiet after the Bloomberg story. Wen's family has now hired lawyers. They're threatening to sue the New York Times, which they won't do because that story was accurate from all intents and purposes. And so, you know, this is just going to be something that is going to further delegitimize the Communist Party. It started with Bo. You know, you had all these allegations that's circulating around China, most of them undoubtedly untrue. But the point is that these were being, people were starting to hear about them across China, and it delegitimized the party one allegation at a time because it was not just corruption. It was lust, murder, treason, all the rest of it.
So fair to say this fifth generation of Chinese leadership is pretty different from the previous four. As you look at it, would you come to that conclusion?
Well, it's going to be much more conservative if the rumors prove to be true, because they basically say that conservatives will have 4 of the 7 seats on the Politburo Standing Committee. That is going to give them an overwhelming advantage. Also because Jiang Zemin, who now almost appears to be the most powerful politician in China, even though he hasn't held a post for more than a half-decade, he's really been behind this conservative move. And this is a time when China really needs reform, but reform and structural change will be off the agenda. And that really is the problem for China right now, because it does need to have sort of a new paradigm, and the Communist Party is in no position to see structural change go forward.
I think we need a moment here just to better understand what the notion of a conservative in China heading up the Communist Party. But, you know, we think conservative, we might think,
right,
you know, Mitt Romney. What's a conservative in China? What does that mean?
It really means no change more than anything else. Yeah, there are a lot of ideological differences, but the conservatives basically do not want to see change in the way things are going. And that's a real problem because the economy clearly is stumbling. China doesn't have the 7.4% growth that Beijing claims. It probably has something closer to 0 or 1 when you start looking at the electricity numbers and the price surveys and all the rest of it. And so clearly something needs to be done. They need basically a new economic model, much less dependent on exports and investment, much more on consumption. But it takes a lot of change to do that. And conservatives say, no, we're not going to change the model. And clearly, political reform is off the agenda. And that merely means that people in China, you know, always have hope when you have a new leader. Even if you don't agree with the guy, you always have hope that things will get better. But I don't think people are going to have hope in China because the new guys are really basically as bad or even worse than the old guys. And I think that there's really going to be a tipping point in the way Chinese people think about the senior leadership.
Could you take a moment as well and just tell us how these guys get picked?
Well, technically what happens in the 18th Party Congress is that there's a new central committee. There's 2,270 delegates. They pick a central committee of a little bit less than 400. And then on the first day after the Congress finishes, they have what's known as the first plenum. And the first plenum is where the new Politburo Standing Committee is revealed to the world as these guys literally walk out from behind a curtain. And so essentially it's supposed to be a bottom-up theoretically, but really it's top down, where you have senior leaders like Jiang Zemin, who was Hu Jintao's predecessor, people like Li Peng, who was premier during the Tiananmen massacre and is known as the Butcher of Beijing, has been quite influential in blocking reformists from getting on the new Politburo Standing Committee. So you have these old elders who have been reappearing in public recently, basically dictating or at least blocking change. And that really is a problem, because this is indeed a top-down system.
Any women at the top?
There's rumor of one, but I don't think she's going to make it, especially because the Politburo Standing Committee is being reduced from 9 to 7, according to most analysts. And so it really makes it very difficult now to get onto the top 7. This is going to be, again, another all-male Politburo Standing Committee.
Any sense whether or not people in China are disappointed by the fact that there are no women in high-ranking places there?
I'm sure many people are, especially women. But the real issue is I think it's not so much gender or anything else or geographical distribution. It's really what these people stand for. And really what we're seeing is an affirmation of the status quo. And that really is a problem, because China is becoming much more corrupt. The problems are becoming much more severe. And the political paralysis right now is becoming increasingly evident. And that really is a problem. And especially one other thing, and that is, if Hu Jintao stays on as chairman of the Central Military Commission, we're going to have a period of more and more infighting, as they call it, a period of two suns in the sky. You're going to have Hu Jintao, the military boss, and Xi Jinping, the new general secretary. But it's even worse than that, because it's almost a period of three suns in the sky, with Jiang Zemin, the former leader, maintaining a very important hold over important factions in the party.
How old would he be now?
He's 86.
86. And even at that age, he's still wielding considerable influence behind the scenes.
Probably more influence than Hu Jintao, because if these rumors are correct about the new lineup for the Standing Committee, it'll be Zhang's Standing Committee rather than Hu Jintao's Standing Committee. And that's really quite remarkable, in the sense that you have this guy who's been out of power for quite some time, being able to dictate almost the majority of the Standing Committee, and Hu Jintao, who was supposed to be the most powerful person in China, really taking a back seat. I mean, no one would have thought about this a month or so ago.
You talked about 2 or 3 suns in the sky, and while we're up in the sky, I want to follow on that metaphor with this. Successful Chinese leaders were historically seen to have the quote-unquote mandate from heaven. They derive their political legitimacy, of course, by governing in a benign fashion for the overall good of the people. Do you think ordinary Chinese people today see the Communist Party of China as providing good and benign leadership?
I actually don't think so. And I think that the fundamental problem is really more than just a question of whether governance is good or not. I think that if you look throughout Chinese society, there's two things that are really important. One of them is that most people believe that a one-party system is no longer appropriate for China's modernizing society. And that is a fundamental problem that the Communist Party can't get over. And the second thing is anger. Which is throughout all levels of society, because all of the revelations we've had, especially since February, have undermined the standing of the party. So, now we have a party which is basically, their legitimacy is dependent on the continual delivery of prosperity. As the economy sinks, that's a problem. All of these corruption scandals are now starting to come out. You see a new absurdness on the part of the Chinese people. All of these environmental demonstrations, for instance, the thing that's remarkable about them is that there's almost no organization. You see these enormous crowds, and you see the Communist Party giving way almost immediately to people's demands. This is a bad precedent for a one-party system, as people start to lose their fear. Because when people lose their fear, then you see these societies change almost overnight.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Presumably people feel more emboldened and less fearful because they're doing better. And while they might want more political freedom, they certainly have more economic freedom, and they're doing better. Their pocketbooks are doing better today than they were 25 years ago. That's pretty undeniable. So, are you sure you're right on this?
Well, if you were to say that in February, then I'd say certainly yes. But what we have seen is a troubling decline in the Chinese economy, which is evident from all statistics that have been coming out. Even official statistics undermine the official narrative of plus 7% growth. And I think that this is going to be critical because, as people don't see themselves getting better, but they do see leaders walking away with $2.7 billion in the case of Wen Jiabao, the premier, then that really erodes the legitimacy of a government. And so economic prosperity is really important for China, but it's going to have, it's certainly now having an economy which is deteriorating very quickly.
Do you think China needs a kind of a Deng Xiaoping figure, a real strongman who can pull it all together? Because certainly the cleavages, as you've described them, in the Communist Party are pretty apparent right now.
Well, that's certainly one remedy, because now we don't have that strong man. We don't have people who can affect change. Deng came in basically and changed the narrative in the top of the Communist Party overnight because of force of personality. And also because of China. Of course, China was going through a crisis, but he had the force of personality to do that. There's nobody like that in the Communist Party these days, partly because, the China's Communist Party saw the fall of the Soviet Union and they blamed it on the emergence of one man, a Gorbachev. And so what we have seen the party try to do over the last couple decades is to make sure there are no Gorbachevs left in the Communist Party. But that also means you don't have people who can resonate with the Chinese public. You don't have the strong leaders. And so even though most China watchers see this progression from one man to collective rule as progress, in a sense, of course it is, but on the other hand, it prevents now the emergence of what China really needs, and that is a strong individual who can push the country in the right directions.
Somebody at the top of the military who might fill that bill?
That's really everyone's concern, because as all of this has been happening, the military has been breaking free of civilian control. This started in the last political crisis between Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, when Jiang Zemin tried to stay on as chairman of the Central Military Commission after Hu Jintao became general secretary. If we have that same dynamic this time, if Hu indeed stays on as chairman of the Central Military Commission, then you're going to have basically the generals and admirals become power brokers once again. And so I think a lot of the belligerence that we've seen on the part of China and a lot of independent behavior on the part of generals and admirals is really, in my book, the most worrying trend in the world today.
So am I reading you right? You're not sure that the civilian authority actually has authority over the military right now?
There have been too many reminders from Hu Jintao this year that the civilians control the gun, as they say in China, to really believe that the civilians in fact control the military. I think the military is becoming extremely powerful, and many people say that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, will become the most powerful faction in China after the 18th Party Congress. And that's because the generals and admirals have been better able to maintain cohesiveness, certainly much more than the princeling group of Xi Jinping.
Okay, here's a little smart aleck question. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
When did you write your book, The Coming Collapse of China?
2001.
Okay. Gordon, we're still waiting. It hasn't happened yet.
I said in 2001 that it would take 10 years. So I'm about 11 months off. But clearly what we see is a deterioration in the Communist Party's ability to govern. And I may be off by a year or two, but not much more than that.
Really? You still think it could happen in the next year or two?
Yeah, I think that we could be having this discussion a year from now and talking about China as the world's next failed state.
Really?
Really.
From over here, it sure looks a heck of a, and hanging on to all that American debt, they sure look a lot more permanent than I think you're giving them credit for.
The Soviets look permanent even after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We've seen so many governments, some even democratic ones, fall, just completely taking us by surprise. So, China, you can see all of the elements moving in the wrong direction for the Communist Party. Things that have worked for the party in the past haven't. You see all these challenges occurring at the same time. And China's becoming much more belligerent, which means it's not going to have the support of the West and countries around its periphery. So things are moving very much in the way, I think, that undermine the ability of the Communist Party to govern.
I know critics of the regime, of whom you are one, certainly have foretold this and believe it to be in the process of happening. What I wonder is whether Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Citizen in China, who certainly has appreciated and wants the economic freedom, feels as deeply about the need for political freedom.
Most people, even in societies that have undergone revolutions, most people don't want a revolution. No one wants the chaos, the bloodshed, and the violence that occurs with that. But what happens is that people can do things which have revolutionary implications, even if they don't have revolutionary intent. So, for instance, you take these environmental protests, which just come out of nowhere. These could spread overnight. We've seen protests spread across China from one end of the country to the other, some of them violent. And these have the possibility, when the party is no longer so self-assured, that you can see somebody at the top deciding that really there needs to be change. This has happened so many times in Chinese history when you have the most unlikely of characters rise up. And most Chinese people are going to sit on the sidelines. They won't necessarily support a revolution, but they're not going to support the Communist Party. And that's the reason why these revelations this year have really been so corrosive.
But, okay, let's play this through a little bit in our last minute here. If the Chinese Communist Party were to be swept away, would it not be more likely that some kind of military adventurer takes over as opposed to some Jeffersonian riding in on a white horse?
I don't see the Jeffersonian anywhere. And I'm not saying that China is going to be better with a new form of government and new leaders, but I will say that it is going to be different. And I think that we need to be prepared because there are the signs there of the inability of the Communist Party to govern effectively.
Gotcha. Gordon Chang, always good of you to visit us at TVO. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.